Animation blueprints give us more flexibility on which animations and how those animations are played back on the skeletal mesh. Let's go ahead and look at our animation blueprint and set it up for our character. Since we're going to want to set up an animation blueprint on our character, we need to make sure our character uses that animation blueprint. So let's open up my character. Let's go back to our skeletal mesh and change the animation mode to use animation blueprint and point it to our my character and a BP that we're going to be using. Go ahead and compile and save, and we're good to go. If we were to check it out, you'll notice nothing's playing because our animation blueprint is empty. Let's open up our animation blueprint. So my character and a BP in our my content folder, and let's look at it. Now we have two graphs. On the left, we have event graph. We can double click on and we get the code for our graph. And we have anim graph, which is where our animations come into play. Now we can easily just play back an animation like we did before. We can grab an animation, let's say the idle, drag it into our graph, and then connect it up to our output pose. We're going to go and hit compile. We can click compile on the viewport or on the top left, and now it's going to play back by default our third person idle. That's simple, but we want to actually have it controllable. We want it to play the walk animation when we're walking. We want it to run when we're running. We want it to idle when we're not moving. We want to jump when we're jumping. So how do we do that? We need to blend, or we need to use what's known as a state machine. We'll look at the basics for blending first. So if we right click and we look at our different blueprints, we can type in blend. And there's quite a few different blends, blending of different types of poses. But at the top, we have a blend section. And the main one is going to be blend. It just blends two poses together. We can go, for example, from our idle. I'm going to connect from our idle to our A input. And we could blend between our idle and our walk. Now, if we look over here, well, we have two walks. Which one do we want? We never actually renamed our zombie walk, so let's do that now. Go back to my map, my content folder. We'll name it third person walk zombie. If you already did that, kudos for you. We'll go back into our animation blueprint. Now we have a third person walk zombie. We can connect it right up to our B by dragging onto it. And there we go. Now, of course, we need to hook it up to something. So let's drag out of our blend into our result, compile, and now it's going to play back idle or zombie, depending on the value of alpha. So an alpha of 0 is A, an alpha of 1 would be B. You notice every time we're changing something, we have to recompile. The nice thing is we'll be able to fix that shortly. We'll compile. Now it's playing the zombie walk. And a value of 0.5 is going to give us 50% idle and 50% walk that you can see here. But it's still not doing it based on data we're putting inside of our graph. We need to be able to say how fast we're going. So let's look at the two different ways of doing that. The first one is sending data out of your character to the animation blueprint. We have our skeletal mesh. I'm going to drag in a copy of it. We're getting a copy of our skeletal mesh component. If we get the anim instance, this is going to get the current animation instance running, either the animation sequence or a blueprint. And then from there, we could cast it to the correct one. And then we could get set, we could do whatever we want. We now have access to whatever animation blueprint is currently running on this mesh. So we could send data directly to it, like setting a variable called is reloading, or maybe we died and we wanted a death animation to play. It can all be done directly from an outside source, in this case, our character, to the animation blueprint that's playing on it. But we're not going to do that. We're going to get the information inside of the animation blueprint. So I've deleted. I'm going to compile and save, so we don't need that anymore. Go back to our animation blueprint. Now, how do we get data into here? Well, the anim graph determines the animations. The event graph determines the code or the flow and things that are happening to get data in and out. This is our default. You are going to get an event blueprint update animation tick, and then all of our code is going to run, and this is going to fire off as needed when the animation needs to update. You have a try get pawn owner. This is a node that will ask, hey, which pawn are we attached to? What is this animation running on? One thing you want to do, because this may not be accurate at all times, when you're previewing in the editor, you kind of have a little bit of weirdness. You have a preview instance running. Just check and make sure it's valid. We're going to drag off the try get pawn owner. We're going to type in valid. We're going to use the question mark is valid and hook that up. It's really simple. If we don't have a valid pawn owner, we're not attached to something valid, just don't do anything. Now we are attached to something. What do we want to do? Well, we want to get two values out of that. We want to simulate our third person template, which can jump and move. So we're going to need to get a speed, so how fast we're moving, and then if we're jumping or not. So let's grab our try get pawn owner, and we're going to cast this to our my character. And we want to do this because while our pawn may know how fast it's going with the velocity, the pawn isn't necessarily a character and won't know if it's falling or not, which our character actually is built in. So now that it's my character, we'll clean this up a little bit here. We can grab values from the my character. In this case, we want two things. We want to know the velocity, and we want to know if it's falling. That's how it knows if you're jumping or not. Let's do falling first. So as my character, we're going to get the movement component. So down here, get character movement. And then we're going to check and see if you're falling. So if we do get is falling, it's not going to work. Get falling, no. Even though it's a getter, it's just called is falling. So right here, this will let us know if we're falling. We want to save this for use later. So items in here, we saved the variables, and then we can use them in our animation graph. Next, we're going to drag off is falling, promote it to a variable, and then call it is falling so we can keep track of this later. We're going to want to go ahead and hook it up so that way we can save that variable for later use. Now we need to figure out what speed we're going to do. Now we can either grab from our pawn itself and check for the velocity, but in our case, we're going to get our character and we're going to go ahead and get the velocity. Now, the velocity itself is a vector. It's not exactly what we want. What we want is more the length of the velocity. That'll give us in Unreal units how fast we're going. So you can see if we type get length, it doesn't work. We actually want vector length, which you can see here under the math section. This is going to give us a float value that we're going to use for speed. So let's go ahead and drag off, promote to a variable. We'll call this one speed. Once we hook it up, that's it. That is all of our variables. That's all we're going to need for later. We have our is falling to determine if we're falling and our speed to determine our speed. Back inside of our anim graph, we can go ahead and hook up our speed. But the problem is, as you can see here, it's asking for an alpha. Well, the nice thing is the blend node has more than just the alpha. If we check our details panel, we have the input type, floats, bools, and anim values. So let's choose the bool value, and now we can plug in a bool. We're going to get our speed. We're going to check and see if our speed is greater than a number. So in this case, if it's greater than 0, 0 means we're not moving. And we'll plug that into our blend. Now, if our speed is greater than 0, we can play our walking animation. And you can see here, when we start walking, we're now playing our walking animation. And we're not walking, we're playing our idle animation. So the blends are great. It allows us to easily blend together two animations, as you can see here. There's actually other blends where we can blend more than two, but they become a little more complicated. What we're going to want to do is create a state machine. That'll let us determine what state we're currently at, maybe walking, idling, running, or jumping, and easily choose which output animation we want and plug that into our output pose.